Jaden, an 11-year-old black boy, navigated the city streets with a quiet determination etched across his face. His clothes, worn and tattered, bore the marks of struggle, frayed at the seams from too many days exposed to the harsh realities of life. His shoes, once sturdy, were now held together by little more than willpower and fraying laces. Each day was a fight, searching for food, finding shelter, and staying out of harm's way. The streets, both his battleground and his home, offered no comfort, only survival. Yet despite the weight of his world, Jaden refused to let it crush his spirit. His face, often streaked with dirt, his hair wild and unkempt, still carried a glimmer of something rare: hope. Though he had witnessed more than any child his age should, he clung tightly to the belief that life held more than just suffering. That belief set him apart. While others in his situation surrendered to despair, Jaden pushed forward, unwilling to be defined by his circumstances. Society had written him off, but he refused to accept its judgment. Each day followed a relentless pattern. He would sit on street corners, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd for any opportunity, a discarded meal, a fleeting moment of kindness, anything to make the next few hours bearable. Most people walked past him without a glance, lost in their own world. To them, he was invisible, a part of the scenery, a boy without a story, without importance. The few who did notice him saw only his ragged clothes and dirt-streaked face, never the intelligence behind his eyes or the kindness in his heart. To them, Jaden was merely another statistic, an uncomfortable reminder of the lives they chose to ignore. Amid the city's relentless motion, Jaden observed the throngs of people weaving through the streets, all too absorbed in their own affairs to acknowledge the boy moving in their shadows. The rhythmic clatter of heels on pavement, the incessant hum of conversations, the glow of phone screens, it all melded into a background of indifference. But then something broke the pattern. Sarah Mitchell walked with purpose, her presence commanding attention. Flanked by colleagues, she exuded confidence and power. As the FBI chief, she had earned every ounce of respect that followed her, her pristine uniform a symbol of her authority. People moved aside for her. She was a woman in control, always one step ahead, until she wasn't. One moment, Sarah was walking with purpose. The next, she lurched forward, a sharp cough tearing through her. Her hands flew to her throat, her face twisting in panic. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. A piece of food lodged in her airway, cutting off her breath. Her colleagues, lost in their conversations, didn't notice right away. The crowd around her, as indifferent as ever, barely spared her a glance. Sarah gasped, her body trembling as her vision blurred. The bustling city, once predictable and within her command, had become a blur of sound and movement she could no longer control. She struggled to draw in air, but her throat remained stubbornly closed. The edges of her world began to darken. And then, Jaden saw her. Standing at the edge of the crowd, he noticed the shift in her stance, the panic in her movements. While others remained blind to her distress, Jaden saw everything. His heart pounded, but he didn't freeze. He had seen desperation before, in himself, in others who fought to survive. He knew that when someone couldn't breathe, there was no time to hesitate. Without a second thought, Jaden moved. The city had ignored him his entire life, but he would not ignore someone else's suffering. His small frame wove through the crowd, his instincts sharp. He had no power, no authority, no place in their world. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Jaden refused to stand by and do nothing. Jaden, an 11-year-old black boy, didn't hesitate. While the crowd stood frozen, their faces painted with confusion and hesitation, he moved. His small frame wove through the gaps between stunned onlookers, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The world around him blurred, the honking of cars, the distant hum of conversations, the rhythmic footsteps of strangers. None of it mattered. The only thing that did was the woman struggling to breathe. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Her hands clawed at her throat as she gasped, desperate for air that wouldn't come. Jaden had seen people choke before, on food, on smoke, on fear. He knew that hesitation could mean death. His muscles tensed, his hands clammy but steady, Without thinking, he wrapped his arms around her abdomen, placing his hands just below her ribs. He had seen this done before, in movies, on the streets. He had never tried it himself, but he had to. He pulled. Nothing. Sarah's face remained frozen in terror. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Doubt, uncertainty. No one stepped forward. No one acted. Jaden gritted his teeth, adjusted his stance, and pulled harder. A final, desperate thrust. Sarah lurched forward with a violent cough. A small piece of food flew from her mouth and clattered onto the pavement. The color rushed back to her face as she gasped, her breath ragged but returning. Her hands trembled as they clutched at her throat, realization dawning in her eyes. For a brief moment, time stood still. Then she inhaled sharply. I can breathe," she stammered, her voice raw with shock. She turned to Jaden, staring at him as though seeing him for the first time. Her eyes, moments ago filled with panic, now held something else, disbelief, gratitude. "You saved me," she whispered. The world around them seemed to shift. The people who had once walked past Jaden without a second glance, who had dismissed him as another invisible child, now looked at him with something different. Respect, curiosity, maybe even admiration. Jaden's hands still shook. His pulse still pounded, but he stood tall. He had done something that mattered. He had saved her life. Sarah took a step closer, her fingers still trembling as she reached toward him. "Thank you," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. Jaden didn't know how to respond. His life had never been about moments like this. It had been about survival, about scraping by, about being ignored. But now, for the first time, he had done something real, something undeniable. Then, just as quickly as it came, the moment shattered. A scoff. A cruel, biting laugh. "Why is a kid like him even touching her?" Jaden flinched. The words were sharp, cutting through the fragile moment like a blade. He turned, his stomach twisting as he saw a white woman standing in the crowd, arms crossed, lips curled in distaste, just looking for attention. The murmurs in the crowd shifted. Admiration soured into something else. Skepticism, discomfort. A man in an expensive suit shook his head, muttering something under his breath. Jaden's chest tightened. He had just saved someone's life. He had done what no one else dared to do. And yet, here he was, still being looked at like he didn't belong. His hands clenched into fists. He had expected gratitude. Instead, he was met with judgment. Even after proving himself, he was still just another black boy in tattered clothes, someone the world refused to see for anything more. The man in the expensive suit looked down at Jaden with a sneer, his lips curling in disdain. What does he even know about saving lives? Probably just wanted to be the center of attention, he muttered, his tone dripping with judgment. The words cut deep, deeper than Jaden expected. He had faced cruelty before, had been ignored and dismissed, but this was different. He had done something good, something real. Yet instead of gratitude, he was met with scorn. A woman standing behind him let out a cold laugh. "He's just a homeless kid," she scoffed. "What kind of hero could he possibly be?" The words echoed in his mind, ringing louder than Sarah's gasps for air, louder than the beat of his own heart. They didn't see him, not truly. To them, he was nothing more than a statistic, just another black boy on the streets, faceless and forgotten. They didn't see the fear that had gripped him when he saw Sarah choking, the urgency that had pushed him forward, or the desperation in his heart that made him act. They didn't see his humanity. Jaden stood still, his body tense, his heart pounding. Every word from the crowd landed like a blow, each one heavier than the last. He had saved someone's life, something none of them had even thought to do, but none of that mattered. The truth didn't matter. All they saw was where he came from, what he looked like. In their eyes, he was still nothing. Behind him, someone muttered just loud enough for him to hear. "Bet he thinks he's a hero now." "What? Does he expect us all to thank him?" His fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't respond. He knew there was no point. Nothing he said would change their minds. They had already decided who he was before he even opened his mouth. For a brief moment, a wave of exhaustion crashed over him. The weight of their judgment pressed against his chest, suffocating and cruel. But then, just as quickly, another feeling rose up, a quiet, unshakable certainty. He had saved Sarah. He had done what was right. No amount of sneering or whispered mockery could take that away from him. Sarah stood a few feet away, still catching her breath, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. But something had changed in her expression. The fear, the lingering shock, was gone. In its place was something sharper, something fierce. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. The murmurs around them began to falter as she straightened her shoulders, her presence commanding attention. "This child just saved my life." Her voice rang out strong and unwavering, cutting through the air like a blade. The crowd fell into stunned silence. "What you're doing right now," she continued, her words slow, deliberate, filled with quiet fury, "is disgusting." A heavy hush settled over the street. The judgment, the whispered insults, the sneering glances, it all came to an abrupt halt. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. For the first time since this all began, he wasn't alone. The jeers and whispers that had filled the air moments ago now felt insignificant, swallowed by the weight of Sarah's words. She wasn't just defending Jaden, she was speaking for every person who had ever been judged unfairly, dismissed because of their appearance, background, or the color of their skin. She took a step forward, her voice steady but laced with a rising intensity. "You look at this boy, and all you see is a homeless black child," she said, her eyes scanning the faces of the crowd. "You assume he's nothing. But look again. He's the only one here who had the courage to act, the only one who didn't hesitate. You don't see his worth because of your own ignorance, but let me tell you, he's worth more than all of you put together." Her words struck like a hammer, shattering the fragile wall of judgment that had surrounded them. The onlookers who had so easily mocked Jaden only moments before now stood frozen, their faces shifting from arrogance to unease. The truth hit them like a force they couldn't ignore. They hadn't just belittled a boy. They had overlooked a hero. Sarah turned to Jaden then, her expression filled with something unmistakable, admiration, pride. She looked back at the crowd, her voice unwavering. "Don't you dare judge him," she said, each word sharp and deliberate. "He is a hero, and just because he doesn't look like you, just because his life isn't wrapped in privilege, doesn't make him any less." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. It stretched between them like an unspoken reckoning, forcing everyone in that space to confront the truth of their own prejudices. Jaden felt the weight of it pressing against his chest, but for the first time, it wasn't crushing. It was freeing. He had saved her. He had done something that mattered, and now someone powerful, someone respected, was standing beside him, making sure the world knew it. The people who had once been so quick to judge now stood in quiet reflection. Some lowered their gazes, ashamed. Others turned away as if trying to distance themselves from their own cruelty. A few hesitated, their expressions betraying the slow realization that they had been wrong. Sarah inhaled deeply, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. "You don't know him," she said, shaking her head. "But I do, and I promise you the world will know him too. Because this child, this boy, is worth more than your ignorance." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the crowd slowly began to disperse. The murmurs died down. Some people walked away, embarrassed. Others tucked their phones into their pockets, the weight of their earlier mockery now hanging over them like a shadow. Jaden stood in the middle of it all, his heart pounding. But it wasn't from fear this time. It was something else, something foreign, yet powerful. Dignity. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. Sarah turned toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, as if making sure he knew that she wasn't just walking away like the others. The noise of the city faded into the background, leaving only the quiet tension between them. She stopped just inches away from him, her expression softening. Then she crouched down, her knees pressing into the pavement so she could meet his eyes. And for that moment, for that single, fleeting moment, it was just the two of them, standing in the space where everything had changed. The murmurs of the crowd, the piercing stares, and the lingering judgment all seemed to dissolve as Sarah placed a steady hand on Jaden's shoulder. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than before. There was no command, no authority, just sincerity. "You're a true hero." Jaden's breath caught in his throat. He had never expected those words, never imagined that someone like Sarah, someone with power, with influence, would say them to him. And yet, it wasn't just her words that shook him. It was the way she looked at him. She truly saw him. Not as a homeless black boy, not as an inconvenience, but as someone who mattered, someone who had done something extraordinary. Then, Sarah did something even more unexpected. Reaching to her side, she unclipped her FBI badge, the emblem of her authority, the very thing that commanded respect in a world that had always overlooked Jaden. She held it for a moment, turning it in her fingers as she studied him. Then, with a deep breath, she extended it toward him. "You deserve recognition," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You deserve everything I can give you." Jaden hesitated, staring at the badge as if it might vanish the moment he touched it. His hands trembled as he reached for it, the metal cool and solid in his palm. But it wasn't just a badge. It was proof. Proof that his actions had weight. Proof that his worth was undeniable. A shift rippled through the crowd. The same people who had once raised their phones to record him with suspicion now stood motionless, their devices hanging limply at their sides. The whispers changed, losing their venom. The crowd, once so eager to judge, now wore expressions of unease. Their prejudices, so deeply ingrained, had been laid bare for all to see. Then one voice broke the silence. "I'm sorry." The words were hesitant, barely above a whisper. A woman in the crowd looked down, shame in her eyes. "I shouldn't have assumed." More voices followed, trickling in like a slow tide. "I was wrong. I should have helped. Thank you, Jaden." Even those who had been the most cruel now seemed to shrink under the weight of their own regret. The shift was undeniable. What had begun as hostility had transformed into reflection, forcing them to confront the ugliness of their own biases. They had seen Jaden as nothing more than his circumstances, but now they were forced to reckon with the truth. He had done what they hadn't. He had saved a life, and the color of his skin had never mattered. Sarah watched this unfold, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling in her chest. She had spoken up, but it was Jaden's actions, his courage, his selflessness, that had shattered the crowd's ignorance. He had done something none of them could ever take away. Jaden, still clutching the badge, felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Pride. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. He felt valued. And the world was about to know it too. By the next morning, Jaden's story had spread like wildfire. News stations ran headlines about the homeless boy who saved the FBI chief. It was more than just a dramatic rescue. It became a conversation, a reckoning. People were forced to confront their prejudices, to see beyond their assumptions. Jaden, the boy no one had ever looked at twice, was now at the center of something bigger than himself. No longer just another kid on the streets, he was recognized for his bravery, his kindness, his strength. People who had once ignored him now spoke his name with admiration. The city, which had once turned its back on him, now saw him as a young man with a future, one filled with promise. And Sarah, she wasn't going to let the world forget him. She stepped forward, offering him more than just gratitude. She offered him opportunity, education, resources, a path out of the life he had always known, not as charity, not as a handout, but as a recognition of his worth. Jaden no longer had to fight just to survive. For the first time, he could dream. For the first time, he could build something more than just a way to get through the day. Sarah's promise wasn't just about giving him a new life. It was about making sure he knew he deserved it, that he was more than the struggles he had faced, that he had the power to shape his own future. And the city? It too had been changed. People who had once been blind to their own biases now had to confront them. The moment on that street had forced them to see beyond race, beyond class, beyond stereotypes. It had cracked something open, an understanding that should have always been there, but had never been given the chance to surface. The world would never be perfect. But in that moment, something shifted. As Jaden walked beside Sarah, the city skyline stretched before them. The streets that had once felt suffocating now felt open, filled with possibility. He was no longer just a boy struggling to survive. He was something more, a symbol of courage, a force of change, a hero. And this time the world saw him exactly as he was.